Welcome to Collars and Calluses, a working theology for young men, where grit meets grace and faith meets the workbench, where young men can come to learn how to grow in the strength, wisdom, and courage that God calls them to. In a world confused about manhood, we open God's Word and roll up our sleeves. We'll talk theology that's not just for the classroom, but for the job site, the gym, the family table, and the front lines of life. We are about forging biblical masculinity that works in the real world for real men to the glory of God. This is Collars and Calluses. Let's get to work. Hey, thanks for joining us on Collars and Calluses. On this episode, we're going to be talking about masculine responsibility, but we're going to be digging into beginning with Proverbs. That's what we promised in the first episode. That's what we're going to start with. We're going to talk about how, to whom Proverbs was written, why it was written, and start looking at that, just a general overview of Proverbs, and then dig into a lot of details along the way. But as I mentioned in the first episode, I'm here, by the way, Bill Smith, with my co-host, Rich Lusk. And
great to be with you, Bill.
Yeah, good to be together again here and talking about these issues. But as I mentioned in the first episode, we are going to also be taking questions, and we'll answer those along the way, whether we fit them into kind of the themes in Proverbs or we just answer them, take an episode or whatever. But we encourage you to send your questions, young men and older men, I guess, to our contact information is in the show notes. You can find our handles on X, and you can see our email address, and you can find us on Facebook and message us, whatever. But you can see all that kind of stuff in the show notes, and you can contact us. We look forward. We can't, of course, we don't know everything, and we're happy to try to answer your questions. If we can, send them on. And if we can do it, we'll give it a shot. But for now, we're going to look at masculine responsibility and specifically how that translates into a masculine burden of performance. And we'll explain what that means as we go. But we couch that in the purpose of Proverbs. And I'm going to throw it to Rich now to start with that, understanding why Proverbs were written and to whom it was written.
So Proverbs is mainly written by Solomon for his son. Since Solomon is king, his son is obviously a prince, a king in training. But because the church is a kingdom of priesthood, a kingdom of priests, there's a very real sense in which that applies to all of us. All Christian men are kings in training, and I think that's absolutely crucial. Bill, would you add anything to that?
Yes, the fact that one of the things, though, I think that in writing to his son, and his son, obviously in the immediate context, I would think is Rehoboam. And Rehoboam is the prince, and he's the king in waiting. And one of the things it shows you, just as a sideline, is that as Solomon brings out in Proverbs, you can be a wise man and you can raise a fool for a son, because Rehoboam definitely shows foolishness. So nothing guarantees raising wise children at all. It has to be in your heart. We'll get into that. But
Solomon certainly did have his failings, which might have contributed to some of that. Solomon
absolutely
lived by his own wisdom in the long run. So that's one interesting thing to consider, is that his wisdom was not a total protection against falling into sin.
Absolutely.
Perhaps even apostasy, depending on how far you want to go with that, how you understand what happens to Solomon when he starts to break the laws of kingship. But yeah, I think that's a really important point. Wisdom, as valuable as it is, wisdom alone is not enough. We live by faith. There's a deep connection between faith and wisdom, but wisdom itself is not going to protect you against apostasy unless it's combined with a lot of other virtues.
Absolutely. One of the things you see about Proverbs, there's a lot that women can learn from Proverbs. The son is taught by his father and his mother. That's in the opening of Proverbs. There's Harlot, Folly, and Lady Wisdom, and they are models for women, one to avoid, one to pursue. But many times people try to androgynize Proverbs, whereas it's just, in one sense, I guess, as you mentioned, it's written to all of us so that we can all learn wisdom. But there is a special focus on the man and his masculine ministry. It is direct instruction to sons and not to daughters. And sometimes it would be really difficult just to apply everything to both sexes. As you're going through Proverbs, it's difficult to do. But man, one of the things that I think we learn in Proverbs, and I think this gets to the purpose of the book, and we'll get to that, is that as Solomon directs his son to in the ways of wisdom, as he instructs him, he is putting a responsibility upon the son that is unique to the son. He has the responsibility for dominion. And I think this gets to the purpose of Proverbs itself. And you want to take that up?
So let me talk. We talked about this a little bit last time. You got to think about it in terms of the creation mandate of Genesis 1. We are made to rule, have dominion, subdue the earth. We're made to multiply, to fill the earth. And so you can break it down into two categories: multiplication and dominion. The book of Proverbs is about fulfilling the creation mandate in a fallen world. So what does it look like to take up the creation mandate and to pursue its fulfillment in a fallen world? And so the book of Proverbs, obviously, as we said, it's a father's instruction to his son. It's the king instructing the prince. And so it's all from the masculine perspective. Absolutely, women should study Proverbs, and not just chapter 31. They should study the whole book. But it is, I'll put it this way, it is written from the masculine perspective, from the fatherly perspective, a father instructing his son. And so it's written from the masculine perspective, and that's an important feature of the book to keep in mind. Let me situate Proverbs a little bit more, and then I want to go into something specific about Proverbs.
Okay.
Proverbs is part of the Bible's wisdom literature. And just as we have a Pentateuch at the beginning of the Bible, we've got 5 books at the beginning of the Bible. We've also got a sort of Pentateuch of wisdom. We've got 5 wisdom books. And so you've got Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Psalms, Song of Solomon, and Job. And so collectively, they form this body of wisdom literature that Scripture has given us. Now, wisdom is not limited to just these books. I would say the Torah, much of the Torah is kind of a sermon, especially Deuteronomy, obviously, but even other parts of Deuteronomy, and it's full of wisdom. I would say there are many teachings of Jesus that would fall into the category of wisdom literature. I think even the Sermon on the Mount can be considered wisdom literature in a certain kind of way. And some of the parables of Jesus and so forth, a lot of connections with the wisdom literature there. But think of it this way. And there's a lot of different ways to break this down. I'm just giving you one. So this is one angle on it. Proverbs is wisdom for young men. Ecclesiastes is wisdom for older men. Psalms is wisdom about worship and Israel or the church. But there's also, and maybe sometime I can develop my theory on this. I actually think Song of Solomon in some ways is the counterpart to Proverbs, that it's wisdom for young women. We're not going to go into that here because that's not the target audience of our podcast. But even though it's about the king and his bride, I think there's a very deep sense in which it's wisdom for young women. And then, of course, you've got Job, which is wisdom about suffering and how to understand our suffering in terms of the cosmic battle between Yahweh and Satan and all of that. And it's certainly, I mean, all the wisdom literature is Christological. That especially, I think, comes to the forefront with Job. But here's a way to think about the book of Proverbs that maybe listeners haven't considered. Proverbs, if you read Proverbs from beginning to end, the early chapters of Proverbs are sort of lengthy speeches that sort of hang together with themes. And at the end of the book of Proverbs, you return to that. So the most well-known one, of course, is the speech about the godly woman, the godly wife, the virtuous wife in Proverbs chapter 31. But then in the middle, it looks like it's just a bunch of random sayings that sometimes repeat or sometimes partially repeat. And it doesn't look like there's any rhyme or reason to it. I think that there is a structure to it, although I don't know that anybody's completely figured it out. You've probably done actually more work on that kind of thing than I have, Bill. But I do think there's some kind of order or structure to it. But I would say that in terms of the overall book, Proverbs tells a story. And the story that it tells is a courtship story. Because what the father does with his son is he presents before his son 2 women, one he should avoid and one he should pursue. There is Lady Wisdom, that's who he should pursue, and there's the harlot Folly, that's who he should shun and completely avoid. And these 2 women keep popping up. Wisdom is depicted as a woman, and she cries aloud in the street and wants the young man to listen to her. But harlot Folly has a message for the young woman too, a very different kind of message, a very seductive one. And of course, all too many young men fall for harlot Folly. But the whole book is structured as a courtship, which of these two women will he pursue? And when you come to the end of the book, what you find is that our king in waiting, the prince who is in training, has chosen Lady Wisdom, the virtuous wife of Proverbs 31, to be his queen. And so they will rule the kingdom in wisdom. That's the goal of the book. That's the trajectory. So that is a way of thinking about it. It's not a random collection of wisdom speeches and wisdom sayings.
Right.
There actually is an order, an overall pattern to it, a structure to it, and it's got a courtship pattern. Which of these two women will he pursue? And at the end of the book, you see he's made Lady Wisdom his wife, so she is his queen, and they'll rule the kingdom together. Obviously, men and women rule differently, but that's the picture that you have. That's kind of the overall structure of the book. And I think that's a really helpful way to think about it and kind of keep in mind the big picture of what's happening in Proverbs. I talked about Proverbs in terms of the creation mandate. Another way to approach this, and we mentioned this in the previous episode, is Proverbs is structured in terms of a man's work and a man's wife, because those are the two, from a man's perspective, those are the two sides of the creation mandate. He's got the dominion side, that's his work, and Proverbs has a whole lot to say about work and the wealth that comes from it, and the temptations of laziness, which are huge for young men, how the misuse of alcohol can destroy your work ethic, how words relate to your work, all of that. A man who does his work with excellence will stand before kings. So it's got a lot to say about work. And as I just said, it's really a courtship story. So of course it's got a lot to say about women. And the man needs wisdom about women, and he also needs to make a woman his own personal lady wisdom. And that's really what a man's wife becomes too. So that's kind of a big picture, overarching framework for the book.
Yeah. A couple of things that are, while you were talking, just popped in mind that I think are very interesting along those same lines is that when you're seeing also, because you set Proverbs within the 5 wisdom books. And as you even expand that out, you go to where Proverbs fits or where the wisdom books fit within the whole structure of scripture. And you've got a progression of maturity all through scripture. And so in Genesis, at the creation, God creates Adam, and then he creates Eve from his side. Adam has no choice about what woman he's going to choose. God makes her, gives her.
It's an arranged marriage.
Yeah, it's an arranged marriage, gives her to Adam. And Adam's obviously extremely happy with what God's given him. But when you come to Proverbs, now the son has to make a choice, which shows, I think, an increase in maturity, is that now there are 2 women, and you can't God doesn't just drop one into your lap. It's not, God doesn't give you your soulmate all at one time and you're just happy. You have to discern, because this is the responsibility of maturing men, is that, okay, now you've got to see the world. You've got to distinguish between women. You've got to see their character. Now you're going to have to make a choice. God's not just going to, so to speak, drop a woman from the sky or make one from your side and just give her to you. And so there's that. And it fits within, of course, the creation mandate, is you were talking about the structure of Proverbs. And I always found it interesting. And you mentioned that middle section of Proverbs, that basically chapters 10 to 24, which seem all jumbled up. And I did. When I was working on Proverbs, I was trying to figure out the structure. And one commentator, Dwayne Garrett, on Proverbs, I thought had an interesting insight, and I've used it. And that is, you've got all this structure, and then right in the middle, it's kind of like, it's in a sense, everything's mixed up. Everything is all over the place. And your responsibility, it's kind of like life itself. Everything just kind of hits you. And sometimes there's no rhyme or reason to it. You're being hit by this situation, that situation, this situation, that situation. You have to discern within the time what to do. And so there may be deep structure in those chapters between 10 and 24. I think it's between 10 and 24, but there may be that deep structure there, but there also may be that, okay, God's thrown the jigsaw puzzle out on the table and he's got all these pieces and he's saying, now you put them together.
It's like the sayings are somewhat random because life is random. You never know what proverb you'll need.
Right.
And so just as life comes at us with all different kinds of challenges day by day, and you never know what you're going to face each day when you get out of bed, So Proverbs sort of gives us wisdom in a seemingly chaotic way because
Yeah.
that's just how life comes at us. So there's this match between how life actually works with a lot of messiness and what happens in the book of Proverbs as
Yeah.
well. The thing about that is that we would say, even in the midst of the messiness, there's a kind of divine order that's
Yes.
behind all of it. That's true of
Absolutely.
life. That's also true of Proverbs. But yes, it does look somewhat random because that's how situations confront us in life. You wake up one morning and you didn't know you're going to have to deal with X, Y, and Z that day, but that's what confronts you. And just like you turn to a chapter of Proverbs and you don't know what you're going to get, it's almost like a grab bag of wisdom. And you just kind of reach in. What I pull out this time? Oh, something about the tongue. I'll reach in again. Oh, I got something about the sluggard. Well, I'll reach in again. Oh, I got something about a wife. So yeah, I do think there's definitely something to that, where there's a kind of match between the chaos that often seems to characterize life as we experience it and the fact that these proverbs just seem to be, like you said, just thrown out on the table.
Yeah.
And they all are, and this is what all the different pieces of life are here. Now see if you can snap them together in the right kind of way.
Well,
Couple-
interesting. Okay, let me say one more thing about the structure, because there may be that deep structure within there that nobody has actually figured out. Maybe there are somebody out there who has, but I haven't, and I haven't met anybody who has. But there is a larger structure to Proverbs, and people have structured it different ways, but there seems to be 7 sections to the book of Proverbs, which I think indicates a creation theme with the 7 days of creation. And you've got that creation structure that the form goes to the responsibility that the son has, and that is we are to be world builders, and because that's what wisdom does. And right there in chapter 8, wisdom comes along and is the master craftsman, doing these things in the beginning, creating the world. And that is the image, that is what men are supposed to be doing. We are supposed to be crafting and ordering the world. And so and with that, because there are these 2 ladies, and this is what you have, you got Harlot, Folly and Lady Wisdom. What the son has to do is now choose his helper that's going to help him organize the world and build the world that God's called him to do.
Which again is tying the book into the creation mandate, because that's what the creation mandate is about. It's about building a world. It's about building a God glorifying civilization. And that's how we need to understand our work. God's given us a project, like the parable of the talents in a way is about this. God gives you a talent. God gives you certain abilities and opportunities. And now he says, give me a return on my investment. And a wise son will choose a wise helper to assist him in that project of giving God a return on his investment, on being able to build. Basically, God's given you a little piece of the creation. You've got to rule over it. And some people rule over there as well, and some people don't. But if you rule over it wisely, you're going to take that little piece of the creation, and over the course of your life, you're going to make it better than what it was. And it might be a business, or it might be farmland, or it might be some kind of management job, or it might be pastoring a church, whatever it might be. You take that little piece of the creation of the culture and you cultivate it and you make it better. And it takes wisdom to do that. And you also need a helper by your side.
Yes.
Do that. So yeah, that's absolutely true. Couple other things here to consider. I like to compare Proverbs and Ecclesiastes because I think that there are interesting connections. There's a lot of overlap between them, but they're also different in some ways. And I talked about, again, this is not the only way to approach these books, but it's one way that I like. Proverbs is training in wisdom for the young man. Ecclesiastes is the reflection upon life by a much older man. And so it's wisdom for older men. And so there's some interesting things there to consider. You read Proverbs, and in a certain way, life seems pretty simple. It seems like there's this moral cause and effect in the universe. And again, we distinguish Proverbs from promises. Proverbs are generalizations. In fact, I think what you really have are 2 different wisdom in Proverbs and Ecclesiastes. Proverbs is about the value of wisdom. Ecclesiastes is about the limits of wisdom. So why is wisdom valuable? It's valuable in Proverbs because wisdom recognizes patterns that God has built into the fabric of creation. Wisdom recognizes moral cause and effect patterns in God's world. God has designed the world to work a certain way. And if you try to live in the world contrary to that design, it's like the old saying, if you run your hand against the grain of the wood, you're going to get splinters. If you flaunt God's design, if you challenge God's design and try to design your own life, what's going to happen? Things are going to go bad for you. So you read Proverbs and it's like, if you do A, B is going to happen. If you do C, D is going to happen. And it looks very straightforward because really, in a way, that's what children need is
Mhm.
they need all the complexities of life in a way made simple for them so they can start to grasp these patterns that are there in reality. So a child sins and you discipline him. A child disobeys and you spank him. So he learns if I do A, B is going to happen.
Right.
But then he does, he obeys and he gets praise. He gets rewarded in some way. So if I do C, D is going to happen. And you're ingraining these certain patterns into your child because that's what you need when you're young. Now, Proverbs does hint at the vaporous nature of life that
Mhm.
sometimes things don't seem to work out that way. Sometimes it seems like that moral cause and effect is interrupted. Sometimes it seems like you can do all the right things and still get a bad result. And it seems like the righteous sometimes don't prosper. And sometimes it seems like the wicked do prosper. But in Proverbs, generally speaking, you've got this straightforward moral cause and effect. Ecclesiastes, by contrast, is about the limits of wisdom.
Yes.
That wisdom can only get you so far. And there's a lot of examples of this in Ecclesiastes, but Ecclesiastes basically points out that what good is wisdom if the wise man and the fool end up buried in the ground in graves right next to each other? What good did your wisdom do for you if you're both going to end up dead in the end? Ecclesiastes is about the limits of wisdom. It's
Right.
Gandalf's line in Lord of the Rings. Even the wise cannot see all ends.
Right.
Wisdom can get you so far in life, but there are certain things that not even wisdom can fully grapple with or understand about the world. So, whereas in Proverbs, wisdom is about pattern recognition, it's about recognizing patterns that God has built into the way he's designed the universe to work. And there's a sort of moral cause and effect in the world. In Ecclesiastes, I would say wisdom is more like faithful improvisation. It's
Mhm.
about being able to faithfully improvise when you're not given a specific rule about what to do. What do you do in the face of this or that? When you have to encounter the mysteriousness of life or complexities of life or problems that simply can't be solved this side of the resurrection, because some problems are like that. There's some things we just
Right.
can't fix in this broken world. Some things are made crooked and they're not going to get straightened out until the last day. So you can think of it this way. I think this is N.T. Wright's illustration, not for Ecclesiastes, but that's where I've adapted it. It's like, say somebody discovered an unfinished Shakespeare play, and we've got 4 acts of the play, but we're missing the 5th act. But the first 4 acts of it are so good. People are like, oh, we've got to put this play on. But then other people say, well, but it's not a finished play, so people are not going to be satisfied with it. And so what they decide to do is, hey, let's have the actors completely immerse themselves in the first 4 acts. And then by the time we get to the 5th act, they can improvise. They will be so
Mhm.
into their character, they'll simply know what to do to bring the story, to bring this drama, this play to some kind of satisfying resolution. Okay, well, a lot of life is that way. You internalize the principles God gives you, and then you encounter a situation which seems to not have any clear-cut answer. You encounter questions that don't have clear-cut answers, or you encounter problems that don't have clear-cut solutions. What do? You have to faithfully improvise. And really, in a way, that is what wisdom is in a fallen world. So again, this is another way to think about it. Here's another big picture sort of archetype or paradigm that you can use. You've got 3 phases of life: a priestly phase, a kingly phase,
Mhm.
a prophetic phase. And if we think of Israel, in Ephesians chapter 4, Paul compares the whole church to a man that's growing up to maturity. Paul does the same thing with Old Covenant Israel in Galatians 3 and 4, how Israel under the law was a child. And now we've entered into our maturity now that Christ has come. So you can think of history as the biography of humanity, and especially the biography of God's people, a kind of corporate biography. Well, in Israel's history, there was a priestly phase of history, basically, which is the creation of the nation with Moses. And what does Moses mainly focus on? Setting up the priesthood and building the tabernacle. It's the priestly era of God's history. Well, if you are a priest, you're like a child. You are under law. You don't decide what to eat. You go to the restaurant and they've got bacon on this and they've got shellfish with that. Well, those things are off limits. There are not many decisions to make. You don't wake up in the morning and decide what to wear, go through your wardrobe or your closet trying to figure out what to wear. God has said, this is what you're going to wear. You don't have many decisions to make. It's all made for you because it's all there. It's clear cut in the law. When you get to the kingly phase, what's the first thing that happens to Solomon after he becomes king? He encounters a situation where there are 2 women fighting over 1 baby. And you can't flip over to Leviticus or Deuteronomy and find a case law that addresses that. There's nothing in Torah that addresses this situation. So what do? You don't, this is an issue that the law does not address. And so what do you need? You need wisdom. And of course,
Mhm.
that's what Solomon has. And so Solomon, understanding maternal nature and having internalized the principles of the law, he's able to faithfully improvise and say, well, just go cut the baby in half. Of course, he didn't intend for the baby to get cut in half. He knew what was going to happen. Okay, but it's a faithful improvisation in the face of what seemed to be an intractable problem, certainly in a situation that's not addressed by Torah. And so as you grow through life, you have a priestly phase of life where your parents are picking out what you wear and picking out what you eat, and you're under their law and you do what they say and you obey everything that they command you to do. But as you get a little bit older, you start to take on more responsibilities. You've got more decisions to make, and you encounter some decisions for which there's not a clear-cut answer. Do I take this job or that job? Do I buy this car or that car? Do I buy this house or do I rent that apartment? And we talked about, who do I marry? This Christian girl or that Christian girl? You have all these questions, and you need wisdom so that you can faithfully improvise where there's not a clear-cut law. So that's another way of thinking about what wisdom is and how wisdom works and why we need it so much. So wisdom has incredible value. That's the message of Proverbs.
Right.
Ecclesiastes tells us life is vapor. Life is shrouded in mist. You can't see more than 2 feet in front of you. Life is like a riddle wrapped in an enigma. And so you've got to learn to faithfully improvise. That's what wisdom is about. So I think Proverbs and Ecclesiastes together give us a complete picture.
Yeah.
And that's something we'll talk more about as we go, I'm sure.
Yeah, yeah. And you mentioned the enigmas in Proverbs. That's an interesting thing because that is really in the introduction of Proverbs. That's what Proverbs are. They are enigmas. They are dark.
Or dark
because
sayings,
because when you start looking at Proverbs, you just, in general, you start, okay, where there are no oxen, the stalls are clean, but much increase comes by the strength of an ox. I said, okay, what does that mean? Well, it means that if you have oxen, you're going to have manure in your stalls. You're going to have to clean them. Well, that's one meaning. The deeper meaning about how things are going is that they're trade-offs. They're trade-offs in life. And you cannot have your cake and eat it too. You've got, if you're going to be productive, there are things that come with that you're going to have to deal with. And so that is, you start thinking about that. Now, as far as the definition of wisdom, scouring the scriptures and seeing how wisdom is defined, and lots of times we just think about it, and getting to Ecclesiastes, lots of times people do think about wisdom being this kind of lever that I can control everything. And if I really have wisdom, and I think Ecclesiastes holds that in check, we may, like you were talking about, we may in Proverbs think, if I get this wisdom, I can do anything. I can control my world completely. And that is one of the issues. We need wisdom to fulfill our dominion mandate. We've got to have it. So we have to be able to, it is an absolute necessity that we grow in wisdom, because we have to order a world, and wisdom created the world. And so one of the ways that I've defined wisdom is knowing how things ought to be put together and having the skill to do it.
Yeah.
And you see that with Bezalel. He's given the spirit of wisdom. God doesn't give him detailed instructions about everything in the tabernacle. He gives him these, and they're fairly detailed, but they're not extremely detailed. He gives him the spirit of wisdom in order to see how, and it's an art where he says this proportion fits this way, and he knows how to put things together so that they're good and they're true and they're beautiful and they reflect what God wants. And that's one of the things that we do. What is the end of wisdom? We're trying to create a world. We're trying to create peace. We're trying to create shalom where these relationships are good. So how do you do that? Well, there are ways to talk. There are ways not to talk. There are ways to live. There are ways not to live. And as we go about our mandate, we have to have this wisdom. But human wisdom is, as you're mentioning, and as we can get the mistaken notion in Proverbs, is that we can absolutely control the world completely. And Ecclesiastes holds a check on that and says, no, human wisdom is extremely limited and fails. God is the only one who can shape the mist and control the vapor.
And shepherd the wind.
Shepherd the wind, yeah.
Yeah. J.I. Packer has a great analogy of this in Knowing God. And I would tell our audience, knowing God, but don't dismiss it because it was popular back during the boomer era. Knowing God by J.I. Packer, really good book. Lots of great theological content, lots of wisdom. But when he talks about Ecclesiastes, so really the point is wisdom, as valuable as it is, it does not give you leverage to
Right.
control your life. It doesn't give you leverage over everything in your life. Obviously, all things being equal, things will go much better for you if you're wise than if you're not. But wisdom does not give you power over life. It doesn't give you power to control everything in your life. Wisdom runs into its limits. But one thing he says, we have this misconception that if we had wisdom, it's like we would be in the air traffic control center of life, and we would be able to have like this bird's eye view of everything that's happening. We know this plane's going that way, this other plane's going that way, and it's landing over here and taking off over there. And we'd have kind of this map of everything happening in the world around us. And we'd have all this special insight into what's happening and what God's up to in the world. That's really not what wisdom is. Wisdom is much more like being in the airplane, trying to land it on a really foggy day where you can't even see the runway, and you have to trust your gauges and radar and the air traffic controller to land the plane.
Right.
And you may not get a perfect landing every time under those conditions, but you can land the plane if you will keep trusting God. And that's why at the root of wisdom is trust. In order to grow in wisdom, and we'll talk about this in a future episode, but wisdom begins with the fear of God. Wisdom begins with humility before God, which is to say, wisdom begins with a sense of our utter dependence upon God. Wisdom grows out of faith that recognizes God is God and we are not. God is God and we're his creatures. And so wisdom doesn't divinize us. It doesn't give us control over life. It doesn't give us a bird's eye view or a God's eye perspective on things. That's not what wisdom is. It's recognizing the patterns that God has built into reality, and it's the skill to live righteously under fallen conditions. Wisdom is also faithful improvisation, figuring out the right thing to do when there's not a clear-cut black and white, turn to this chapter and find this verse kind of answer to the question in front of us.
Yeah, and I know as pastors, even not just as pastors, but as even fathers, you deal with that rearing children all the time. They come to you, and it's not like the prostitutes and a baby, but they still come to you with dilemmas, and there are decisions that you have to make that you can't just throw a verse at. And so it takes skill, because for instance, in parenting, one of the things that you're trying to do, especially if you have multiple children, between siblings, you're trying to help create good relationships between them. So how do you do that? How do you accomplish justice in a situation where somebody thinks he's been wronged and restore that relationship? Because that's what basically Solomon was doing with the two prostitutes, was creating or giving a just verdict and creating where everything was put right. And so how do you put it right? And being put right doesn't simply mean, okay, well, it's just this distributive justice. It is about creating this peace between others. And how do you do that? And as I've gone through Proverbs for years, I've noticed that is one of his aims. It's like when you're talking, how do you speak so that you can create peace, to create this harmony in relationships? There are ways to say things, and I don't want to get off on the rabbit trail too much, but there are ways to say things that may be absolutely true factually, but may not reach this end goal of wisdom, which is to create order and peace that God wants us to accomplish. In dealing with all that, now turning to our main topic, responsibility, masculine responsibility, and burden of performance. All of this is part of our mission. All is part of our creation mandate. The man is created first. He goes to work at the beginning. God gives him work to do. He's naming animals. He's doing all these things. And he realizes, and just cutting through some of the text and through all the debates, he realizes of course, God knows he needs a helper, but he realizes God impresses that upon him that he needs a helper. But the man is responsible for this mission. And the woman comes along as a helper, and we'll talk specifically about what the masculine mission is and how to develop a personal mission, all that stuff, again, in a later episode. But just a general responsibility. Man is responsible for this mission. He's responsible for the world, and he's responsible for the woman in the world. So he has this responsibility. Everything that God has given us as men that is different from the woman has a God-given purpose with a God-given responsibility. And so masculinity if is above all things, I think, a responsibility. It is a mission in itself. Do you have anything about that?
Yeah, I think it's really so. The book of Proverbs doesn't use the word responsibility,
Right.
but it is clearly a major theme in the book of Proverbs that you are responsible for your life. Not everything in your
Yes.
life may be your fault, but it is all your responsibility because even your responses, say to things that have happened to you or um, that people have done to you or said to you, your response is your responsibility. So your life may not be all your fault, the situation you're in. The situation you're in the culture is not all your fault. You're not responsible for interest rates or the stock market or what have you, but your life is your responsibility. And there's nothing more effeminate than a man who won't take responsibility for his life. The
Yeah.
essence of manhood is found in responsibility. And part of what fathers have to do, I mean, obviously, women are responsible for their lives too,
Yes. Yeah.
but there's a very deep sense in which men have broader responsibilities. So, for example, you talk about a household, the wife and mother is responsible for fulfilling her calling, her offices as a wife and a mother. And a man is responsible for fulfilling his offices as a husband and as a father. But the husband is also responsible for the overall state of his household in a
Yeah.
way that the wife is not.
Right.
Responsibility is at the very heart of manhood. And Proverbs shows us that. What is the father teaching his son in the book of Proverbs? It is, if you had to sum it all up, this would be a way of getting at it. You are responsible for your own life. And
Right.
your life largely be the outcome, the product of the choices you have made under the conditions you were given.
Right.
And so you have to take responsibility. And that means, so I really like how Jonathan Haidt has talked about this. He talks about an external and an internal locus of control.
Mm-hmm.
And he talks about those who do not have internal self-control. So they don't have a good handle on their own emotions. They don't have a good handle on their internal desires and attitudes and so forth. And he says people like that often feel like they're being controlled by others. And so, for example, they might blame parents who they think were too strict, or coaches or teachers that they think were too strict, or a pastor or church that they think was too strict. But really, that's not the issue because other people were had those same parents and teachers and coaches and pastors and did just fine. The problem is they don't have a good sense of internal self-control. You can never control the world outside yourself,
Right.
but you most certainly can control the world inside yourself. And he actually points out one of the keys to having a productive life, and actually one of the keys to having a happy life, a fulfilled life, a satisfying life, is having an internal locus of control, knowing that you are in control of your inner world. You can't control circumstances outside of you. You can't control your internal response to them, what you do about it. And that's another way of getting at responsibility. To have that internal locus of control is to recognize I am responsible for myself. I'm responsible for my life. I'm not responsible for all the circumstances that I've been put in, but I am responsible for what I do with those circumstances. I'm not responsible for many things. And actually, there is a problem on the other side, which is taking responsibility for things that are not your responsibility,
Right. Exactly.
which can lead to burnout and all kinds of false guilt and that kind of thing. It's not a sin to be finite. Your responsibilities are not infinite. Your
Right.
responsibilities are confined to the things that God has specifically commanded you to do and what flows out of your vocation or the mission that God has assigned to you. That's your responsibility. So taking responsibility for your life, taking responsibility for yourself means exercising agency. It means taking responsibility for your decisions and the outcome of those decisions. Think about this. So think about you, football season's underway. You have a coach who he calls a bad game and his team loses. And imagine if in the press conference after the game, he said, well, I called the right plays. They just didn't execute them well. It's not my fault. It's the player's fault that we lost. What would we say about a coach? And there are coaches who've done that, but it's not many because usually if you get to that head coaching position, you realize, headship, we talk about headship. Headship means responsibility. It means authority too. So the coach has authority over his players. He's got responsibility for what they do. If they didn't run the plays the right way, that's his fault too. If he called the wrong play in a certain situation, he's got to take responsibility for all of it. And he can't pass the buck. He can't find somebody else to blame. He can't even blame his offensive or defensive coordinator. He's got to take responsibility. He's the one in charge. He's the head. And it's so important to understand that. So when we train boys in responsibility, taking responsibility for themselves, for their actions, for their living space, their living quarters, their
Yeah.
room, or what have you, taking responsibility to do certain chores around the house, we are teaching them. That's the beginning of understanding what headship is really about and what it will mean to be a man. You're growing into this responsibility where you're going to have to take charge, and you're going to eventually, if you marry and have a family and perhaps in your work, you're going to have people under you. They're under your authority, but you're responsible for what they do. If the ship runs aground, even if the captain's asleep in the middle of the night, it's his fault because it's his responsibility. Well, maybe we should distinguish fault from responsibility,
Yeah.
but it's his responsibility. It is his
Right.
responsibility. He's the captain of the ship. He's the head of the ship. And so he's not the one who necessarily did the particular wrong thing that grounded the ship, but he's got to take responsibility for what has happened. And it's so crucial because we live in an age, a very therapeutic age, where people do not want to take responsibility for their actions. They want to see themselves as victims. Maybe they're victims of how their parents raised them, or they're victims of feminism, or they're victims of even mental illness. Now, somebody traditionally would have been considered a sin problem now has been recast as a sickness or a mental illness. And that too is a way of escaping responsibility. I'm not sinning by having anxiety. I've got a disorder. You could take somebody who's an alcoholic. I'm not sinning by my abuse of alcohol. I've got a substance use disorder. And these things that used to be framed because if we frame things in terms of sin, that implies responsibility. If we frame them in terms of a sickness or a mental illness or a disorder, that's a way of evading responsibility. And our culture is full of this. And we see it at the highest levels of our culture, where you have criminals holding high-powered positions in the government who do very corrupt things and are not held accountable.
Right.
So we live in a culture that is seeking to flee from responsibility, flee from accountability. And if you're going to grow into a man, this is something you have to learn, is how to take responsibility and not make excuses and not blame shift, but take ownership of your own life.
Yes.
Think of your life is your own life. You have ownership of it. You are responsible for what you do with it, and you're responsible for the outcome of it.
Now, yeah, and especially if young men are listening here and single men, before they take on the responsibilities of a wife and children, they do need to understand just this about their own lives, is that the choices that they make are theirs and the consequences are theirs. One of the things that Solomon shows his son is there are two women, there are two ways. There's the way of the fool and there's the way of the wise. And I don't know exactly what you did with your children at certain ages, but when mine got to be in the early teen years, I would talk to them about, you're too old for me to, and now at this point, to spank or whatever. But here's what I'm going to tell you. Here's the path that leads to life. Here's the path that leads to death. I can't make you choose, as much as I would want to, in some ways, make you choose the right way. I can't do that now. You've got to make those choices. You've got to be responsible for these. This is the way of life, and here are the consequences. Know that if you go down this path, if you go down the path of the fool, this is what's going to happen. And nobody is responsible for that but you, because you made those choices. But here's the path of the wise. And if you go down that path, here are the consequences. And again, it does get down to that responsibility, and that, as Jocko Willink and Leif Babel would say, the extreme ownership. It's like, no, I've got to do this. And then when you get a wife, children, or you're at a job and you have people under you, whatever, responsibility can be responding, as you mentioned, I think, responding to what people, your inferiors, in the sense of your subordinates, how they act. So if a wife sins or your children sin, your responsibility is to correct that. It's not your sin. The child sinned or your wife sinned. That is not your sin. Your sin would be to ignore it and not correct it and not deal with it. So my masculine responsibility is to respond to my responsibilities of my wife, my children, those under me at the job or whatever. And if I need to fire somebody for what he's done, I fire somebody. If I need to promote somebody, I promote somebody. But if I need to increase my training of someone, that's what I need to do. But that's all my responsibility. And if those guys fail completely and I fail to respond to them, then yes, it's all my fault. And if the ship runs aground, I'm the one who goes on the chopping block. And men, like you said, one of the most feminine things to do is to start blame shifting and to start playing the victim and to neglect responsibility.
The language of burden of performance, some people might say, well, don't women have to perform too? Well, yes, absolutely. They have responsibilities, and you can look at Proverbs 31 and see that. But there is something uniquely masculine about the burden of performance, that men are burdened with protection, provision for the household. They've got authority over the household, but they've also got this responsibility that comes with the household. A man has to perform. And you see that from the very beginning. As soon as Adam is created, he's given work to do. And I'm not, so you can talk about the creation mandate in Genesis 1, which obviously does belong to men and women. But even before the woman is created, the man is given a mission. And we'll talk about mission before marriage at some point, because that's really kind of an episode in itself, pretty much.
Yeah,
but,
absolutely. Number two,
the man is told to guard the garden and to cultivate the garden. He's got, and there are layers of meaning to what is going on there. It's priestly language. So he's to guard the sanctuary, which should have told him right there that there was going to be an invader at some point if the garden needs guarding. He should have recognized that. But also it does tie into a man's calling to work, that work, and especially work in the world, work in the marketplace where you have to perform or you get fired, that is a burden that a man bears, that he has this responsibility. The burden of performance is also really important when it comes to thinking about intersexual dynamics and relationships between men and women, and ultimately a relationship that will lead to marriage, and then what a man needs to do in the context of a marriage. So if a man wants to, so think about this, we both have raised daughters and had daughters get married and all of that. And so when a man is interested in your daughter and he comes to you, one of the first questions you're going to ask is, how are you going to provide for my daughter? You're asking that man, is he willing to accept the burden of performance, to take on the responsibility? Now, not just of providing for himself, but providing for someone else, basically taking over your job as father to protect her and provide for her. The comedian Chris Rock one time said, only women, children, and dogs are loved unconditionally. A man is loved under the condition that he provides something. And men absolutely have to understand that.
Yep.
Okay. When it comes to intersexual dynamics, it's not the sole thing that makes you attractive in the eyes of a woman, but it's a key thing that makes you attractive in the eyes of a woman, is that you have accepted the burden of performance, that you're doing something with your life. She can't follow you if you're not going anywhere. She has to be able to trust that you will be a faithful and competent protector and provider. And that's that burden of performance. You're not going to be loved unconditionally. You're going to be loved on the condition that you perform, that you produce, so think about this. When we talk, and I know sometimes this language gets abused, but when we talk to men who need to do better as men, what do we say? We say, man up.
Right.
There's no equivalent expression for women.
No.
Nobody says woman up. And a big reason for that is because when it comes to attraction between the sexes, men are attracted, and again, this is not the whole of attraction, but it's very much at the heart of it. Men are attractive because of their achievements, because of their performance, because what a woman knows innately by her creation design is that she will be dependent upon a man. At some point, she's going to have a child, and she's going to be very vulnerable during pregnancy and after pregnancy, and she's going to need a man who can basically be a covering for her and be a shelter for her. And a man has to be able to provide. He's got to be able to perform. He's got to be able to protect. And so a man is not given by nature what he needs to attract a woman. He has to build it over the course of his life. And that's why we say mission before marriage. You've got to go out and do something and prove that you've at least got potential that you're beginning to actualize before you can go marry a woman, because that's key to your role and who you are in this relationship as the man.
Absolutely.
By contrast, you could say what a woman needs to attract a man is largely given to her by nature.
Right.
So women just are, men have to become.
Right.
Woman just is, a man has to become. What are you going to do with yourself? And how are you going to take your interests and your passions and desires, whatever else, and monetize those somehow in the
Right.
economy, that you can be a provider. That is your burden of performance.
Yeah.
And interesting, obviously in today's world, a lot of women also work. And I think once women have children, that needs to become the main focus. She can still be economically productive in certain ways, but she can't be career focused the way that the man's going to be career focused, because as Titus 2 says, she's supposed to be focused on her children, her husband, her household. That should be really her center of gravity.
Right.
But it is interesting in situations where, so think about our modern, very progressive world. Even so, in situations where the wife out earns the man, where she is the primary breadwinner, it causes all kinds of marital problems. It causes a decrease in attraction. It's actually what's behind a lot of sexless marriages. And it also, in those situations where, and I'm not talking about a situation where a man's in graduate school, or
Right.
like obviously where he's training for a vocation, or obviously you can make exceptions for injury and whatnot. I'm just
Right.
talking about, again, this is wisdom. We're talking about general patterns here, where the woman out earns the man and therefore really has higher status in that kind of way than the man does. It creates all kinds of marital dissatisfaction. Neither one of them are satisfied with it, and it leads to an astonishingly high divorce rate when the woman out earns the man.
It really
Because
does.
you're reversing nature. You're reversing nature.
Yeah.
So again, think about it this way. This is one of those red pill proverbs, I sometimes call them.
Yeah.
In the case of men, nature is cruel and time is kind, because he doesn't have what he needs to attract a woman by nature, but over time he can build it. For a
Right.
woman, it's the other way around. Nature is kind, time is not. She has what she needs to attract a man by nature, her physical beauty
Right.
primarily, because that signals that she will be a suitable partner for multiplying with. I won't go into any more details than that. I'll fill it in from there.
You figure it out.
But time is cruel. Nature's kind, but time is cruel, because over time, that Proverbs 31 says
Yeah.
a
It's
woman's
vapor.
beauty is vaporous.
Right.
It's fleeting.
Yeah.
So thinking of this in terms of the male-female, in terms of intersexual dynamics, the male-female relationship, it's so important for men to understand this, to attract a woman and to keep building that attraction over the course of your marriage, which is what you want to do. You've got to be competent. You've got to have skills. You've got to take dominion. You've got to subdue something. You've got to perform.
Right.
That is the burden of performance.
It's interesting. Yeah, it's interesting too. And maybe I'm making too much of this, but in the beginning, when God created the man, he gave him a task to do. He goes out and he's naming animals. He's categorizing, he's doing these things. And man never receives any praise at all.
Right.
Then
Right.
all of a sudden the woman's created and he breaks off into song. Because she just exists. And so that it plays into that men become and women are. That it's just it's kind of a given right there.
Right. He's already doing work that's not being thanked or praised. He's not going to get award or any praise for it. The woman just comes to exist, and it is interesting. Somebody might say, "Oh, this sounds like misogyny." No, listen. The very first words a human speaks in the Bible are words of praise to a woman.
Absolutely, yeah.
Because she is the glory of the man.
She evokes poetry in him.
And her beauty inspires him.
Yeah.
How many love songs and how much love poetry is about that? The man who is in, how many wars have been fought? How many fist fights have men gotten into over the beauty of a woman? It's inspired them to do something. In Genesis 29, they'd have to roll the big stone out of the way of the well to get to the water. And normally it would take many shepherds to do that. As soon as Rachel comes up, Jacob goes and does it all by himself, because he is inspired to this great feat of strength by her beauty.
Exactly.
And that's what women do. And it's more than just physical beauty. There has to be those feminine qualities. It's an inner beauty as well, because Proverbs talks about that. The beautiful woman without discretion, it's like a pig with a ring,
Harlot Folly is attractive.
Ring and a pig snout. So it's got to be beauty that's more than just skin deep, or that even that's not going to last. I mean, this is why you can have Hollywood marriages who are between the most physically attractive people in the world, and they still get a divorce because that physical beauty is not enough to maintain attraction and maintain the relationship. So it's not just that, but there's no question the woman is the glory of the man, and he is attracted to that glory. He's drawn to that glory, and that glory inspires him to do great things. When a man has a woman who is beautiful on the inside and the outside, he wants to lay the whole world at her feet.
Oh, absolutely.
He delights in providing for her. He will run through a wall for her
Yes.
because he never feels more manly, you could say, than when he is providing for her and the children that together they have brought into the world. Like he
Absolutely.
knows deep in his heart of hearts, the essence of masculinity is to care for this people. The reality is, when I talk about the wife as being the main breadwinner, when that happens, women don't get any satisfaction in that at all.
No.
In fact, they're frustrated by it. They're
Right.
frustrated when they have to be the main breadwinner, when they have to be the provider. Okay,
Yeah.
because they not what they're designed for. That they don't feel more feminine when they're providing.
Oh, they become much more anxious.
They become anxious and even angry because they believe a man should be providing for them.
Well, this burden of performance, and the women are, men become, that has been, as we've talked about up until 5 minutes ago, that was just kind of a norm. Everybody kind of knew this.
Right. Everybody knew this was folk wisdom.
I know when a young girl, as they say, got her period, they would just say, "Oh, you're now a woman."
Right.
But they had rites of passages for young boys. You've got to go out and perform. You've got to go do something.
Usually it included some very risky or difficult or demanding task by which he would be initiated into manhood. So yeah, that's a great example. Biologically, there's no question when a girl becomes a woman. A girl enters into womanhood at a certain age, and it just happens. But for a man to go from boyhood to manhood, he has to actually accomplish something. And one of the problems in our society, in our culture today, is that we don't have a clearly defined rite of passage for young men. And I don't know how you create one just on your own that would really be meaningful. I think for a lot of young men, it's when they get their first job that's out of college or something like that actually pays them, or if they're in a trade and they've apprenticed for a while and they reach a certain status with that. You could say that's a kind of movement into manhood. Or I think it also ties in with marriage. When a young man marries a woman, it's like, well, now he's proven that he's a man. He won a woman's heart. But we don't have a clearly defined transition point for boys into manhood, and that is a problem. But because it's not something that happens biologically, just because a boy gets bigger, just because he hits puberty, doesn't automatically make him into a man.
Right.
It just, he's a really large boy until he's actually accomplished something. He has,
and in fact, people will make fun of him. His voice cracking, hair growing in places, things like that, and he's foggy headed and everything. They make fun of him until he proves himself.
Yeah. So those are things that I think young men have to understand about themselves and about the world. You bear the burden of performance. So again, the man up message can be abused. I think sometimes that's used unfairly against men, but there's also a definite place for it. And it's actually a biblical expression. So when David is on his deathbed, what are his final dying words to Solomon? He says, "Be a man," or "Prove yourself a man." Or we could translate it, if we wanted to be colloquial, we could translate it as "man up."
Man up, yeah.
Which he goes on to say, he defines it in terms of virtue, keeping God's law, and that kind of thing. It's also going to be killing a lot of people who are rivals. I mean, it's like the man up message was necessary. It's going to take courage and grit and determination for Solomon to do what God called him to do. And of course, then it's also building the temple, which is this massive undertaking that he's got to organize all kinds of laborers and gather all kinds of materials. And it's a great feat of leadership for him to do this. So the man up message plays out in Solomon's life in a lot of ways. Paul says it to the Corinthians in 1 Corinthians chapter 16. You could argue that 1 Corinthians is written to the men of the church, which again is not to say women wouldn't also hear it read and obviously learn all kinds of things and benefit from it. But Paul, throughout the letter, he keeps saying brothers, brothers, brothers. And I don't think we should just mentally insert brothers and sisters. Obviously, women are included in everything he says, but there's a very real sense in which the letter is addressed to the men of the congregation. And the letter spells out why, because the man is the head of his wife, and the liturgical leadership is masculine. It's got all, there's so much in 1 Corinthians about male-female dynamics, and specifically, again, you could say the burden of performance that men have. Oh, your wife's got a theological question? She should ask you at home, and you better have an answer. There's the burden of performance right there. Absolutely. You don't know the answer. Oh, you need to go read a few books. Okay. You need to perform. You need to be able to answer your wife's theological questions. Okay.
Absolutely.
They're the burden of masculine performance woven through the letter. But you come to chapter 16 and he says, be strong. And he says, act like men.
Act like a man, yeah.
Act like men. And then he goes on to say, stand firm and all of that. But that command, it's sex specific. Be a man. That there's a certain content built into manhood. One last way, Bill, I know we need to wrap this up here in just a minute, but one last way to think about this. A way to think about the burden of performance is in terms of how do we judge the sexes? So we can say, for example, that men and women are both supposed to be courageous, no doubt. And there are situations where women really do have to be courageous.
Right.
I think giving birth is an example of that. But then you've also got other kinds of examples in the Bible, like Jael in the book of Judges, who uses deception and acts in a very courageous way to crush the head of the enemy. And she uses domestic implements, and she uses, as I said, deceptive hospitality to do it, but she does it. And it's an act of courage. Women do need to be courageous, but women are not judged by their courage in the same way that men are. And that's why we would say courage is, there's something uniquely masculine about courage as a virtue, as a character trait. All Christians need to be courageous, but it's especially a masculine virtue. And the reason is this. So think about this. When God says he's going to curse a nation, one of the ways he does that is he makes their soldiers like women.
Yeah.
Their soldiers will flee the battlefield as if they were women. And the thing is, if a woman actually fled the battlefield, we wouldn't say, oh, she obviously is not real. She's not a real woman. If she was a real woman, she would have stayed and fought. No, because women are not responsible for protecting the nation.
Right. In
fact, they're not supposed to be defending the nation. They are what we protect. The women are not doing the protection. They're the ones we are to protect. They don't defend the nation. They are the ones who get defended by the men.
Right.
So if a woman flees the battlefield, the battle scene, we don't say she's any less of a woman. In fact, we would say women are not supposed to be out there fighting anyway.
Right.
But if a man flees the battlefield, if a man does not carry out his duty in that kind of situation, we would say, oh, he's not much of a man. Turn in a man card. You were in a situation that required manly courage and you failed. Therefore, you are a failure as a man.
Exactly.
I've used this example before. It's like if you've got, and I'm not recommending anybody do this, but say you've got a group of guys and girls together who are watching a horror movie. I'm not recommending anybody watch a horror movie. Just for purposes of illustration, bear with me here. And they're watching the movie and the girls get scared. We don't say, oh, clearly she's not as much of a woman because she got scared at that movie. No, in fact, we expect that. But if one of the boys or one of the young men got scared in that situation, we'd say, I don't know about him. That's highly suspect. Like you should have more control over yourself and your emotions, and you should not get so sucked into this and lose your, like you have to be able to keep your head, because that's what we expect of men. Like you're expected to keep your head in high pressure situations. There's the old saying, like, why do the men send the women and children to safety when facing some great crisis? It's so they can work out a solution in silence. Because that's what we expect men to do. Men are the problem solvers of the human race.
Exactly.
And that's part of being the protector and provider. We figure things out. When a job needs to be done that's difficult or dangerous, we do it.
Yeah.
One more example of this kind of thing. Feminists have talked about equality for a really long time. Now, feminists did not want to enter the workforce en masse until there was air conditioning and lots of office jobs. So take that into account here. But here's the thing. They've talked about equality and wanting to have complete parity. And so, for example, feminists will say, we want 50% of all CEOs to be women, and we want 50% of all senators to be women. And that's the kind of the logic of feminism. Okay. Well, the thing is, let's take work-related deaths. What percentage of work-related deaths happen to men versus women? It's about 95% men who die on the job, because men do all the difficult and dangerous jobs. And I've never heard any feminists say, well, we really need to get that death rate up to 50-50. We need more women working on oil rigs, and we need more women doing underwater welding. They don't do that. They don't go after difficult, dangerous jobs. Men will always be the infrastructure of civilization. It is up to men to build and maintain civilization. It's that hard outer shell that then makes feminine flourishing within it happen. So the man builds the house and the woman the dome. It's what makes it possible, right? So that's the burden of performance. When there's a difficult, dangerous job to do, the man does it. You're in bed with your wife at night and you hear a noise downstairs that doesn't sound right. It's the man's job to get out of bed, grab his flashlight and his baseball bat or his shotgun and go down there and figure out what's going on. And if a man sent his wife out to do that, we would all say, he's just not a man.
Sorry.
And the ultimate example of this, and where this traces back to, of course, is in the Garden of Eden, because this is where everything goes wrong and everything traces back to this. Genesis chapter 3, Adam was to guard the garden. That's part of his burden of performance. The serpent comes in, and what does Adam do as the serpent starts to talk to and deceive his wife? He stands by and he watches.
Right.
He is effeminate. He doesn't man up and crush the serpent's head the way he should have. At the very moment that that serpent contradicted God's word, he should have crushed the serpent's head. He should have fought on behalf of his bride. Instead, he stands by and watches all of this unfold as the serpent deceives his bride. In a sense, his bride commits spiritual adultery with the serpent,
Right.
and taking the food from the serpent. And then he goes right along with it by eating the forbidden fruit himself. And we know what happens from there. He had the burden of performance to protect her, to protect the garden. He failed to carry that burden of performance. So the burden of performance is a uniquely masculine thing that young men have to embrace. To grow from a boy into a man, you've got to embrace responsibility, and with that comes the burden of performance.
Right. And now, in closing that out, because there's some overlap here, we're going to talk about how that fits into masculine friendships later. But that's one of the reasons I think men also just rib one another a lot. Because there's a performance standard for men, and it's natural. Of course, it can, like everything, it can go overboard. It can be bad. But one of the things that men do is they test one another to see who's going to perform, who's going to come up, who's going to man up like that.
And men are also assembling themselves into a hierarchy.
Yeah, exactly.
Whereas women have collectivist instincts, which in the context of the home is just fine, because everybody needs to eat. Even if you're the weakest, you need to eat. The weakest family member still needs to eat. And so women have collectivist, I'm not going to say egalitarian because that goes too far, but collectivist instincts. And in the domestic sphere, that's perfectly fine. That's well and good. That's appropriate. In the political world, or on the ball field, or on the battlefield, that's a disaster.
It is.
And so in those spaces where men are called to operate in those masculine domains, there is a hierarchy, and men are not, unless they've been brainwashed by egalitarianism, men are not bothered by hierarchy. In fact, we know that there's a very real sense in which our lives depend upon hierarchy. When we are in the trench fighting the enemy, we want the best possible man in charge. We don't want an EI hire for that. We want the best possible man to be in charge because our lives are at stake. And that's just built into masculinity, that understanding of hierarchy. And of course, depending on what domain you're in, the hierarchy can change. If you go fishing with a bunch of guys, the hierarchy may look one way. And then if you go bowling, the hierarchy may look a different way. And if you go hunting, it may look still another way. And if you go do something else, the hierarchy could rearrange itself yet again, because not every man's good at everything, obviously.
Based on performance.
Got to strive for competency. No man's going to be omnicompetent. But men are very at home with hierarchy. We're glad that there are team captains. We're glad that there's a commander in chief. We're glad that there's a general and a lieutenant. And so that's how men operate. That's how we function. And men do kind of test one another and size one another up to kind of see how we fall in line in the hierarchy.
Yeah. All right. Yeah, we do need to wrap this up. Just a few closing thoughts from me, to some takeaways and some work to do for young men. A couple of things you need to understand when we talk about the burden of performance and masculine responsibility is that manhood is not bravado. It's not machismo. Guys who act like that, guys who are boisterous and try to just put themselves out there lots of times with that kind of bravado, they're generally insecure. They're fearful. Men don't have to go around telling people that they're men. They don't have to get online and tell people that they're men. One of the surest signs that you're not. Yeah, it's probably a sure sign that you're not. Men just perform, and sometimes it's thankless, sometimes it's praiseless, but they perform because that's what men do, because they measure up to their responsibilities, and they do them. They allow their performance to speak. And Proverbs speaks about this. A man with great skill, he'll stand before kings. You don't have to always go tell everybody, I'm a man. This is what I do in the weight room. This is what I do, all that kind of, you just do, and people will notice the burden of performance. That is how you achieve it. Men also don't go around and mope with hurt feelings if other men rib them or other people rib them. We don't play the victim card. We take criticism and we evaluate it. If it's true, we correct ourselves. If it's not true, we discard it. That's it. We take things and we make ourselves better. That's what you're supposed to do. Now, we're all learning how to do this because criticism is difficult at times, depending on who's criticizing. If it's a close friend or somebody online, it doesn't, different ways you take it. But one of the things that that's doing is it's calling you up to be more mentally tough. And you need mental toughness. We'll talk about that in discipline at some time. You need that mental toughness to accomplish your task in the world. So you need the ribbing, you need the criticism, you need all that. That's part of you growing up into be a man. So you need that, and you need to learn how to handle it, and you need to learn how to respond to it appropriately and to appropriate it into your life and not simply just react and fight fire with fire. So I want to call you to be more mentally tough. Think about those types of things. Also, in taking this responsibility on, push yourself, get uncomfortable, try something new, take the risk. And we'll talk about mission later and things like that, but you need to get out of your comfort zone. I love Jocko Willink, and his books I think are great. And when applied properly, there's no growth in the comfort zone. You got to push yourself. If you're going to grow, if you're going to grow in your masculinity, you've got to push yourself. You got to think about what you're doing and how it fits into your masculine calling. And so push yourself to do those things that are uncomfortable for you. And as long as it fits within your mission. But that is that performance that you have. Don't just sit there and be comfortable. Keep pushing yourself, keep taking risks, and do the hard work. Okay. Rich, anything else?
Man, that's great. What you just said is a great exhortation to end on.
Good. So young men, old men, all of us, get to work. We'll see you next time.